Welcome to the class of academic discussion. Today, we will talk about how to conduct an academic survey. So, everybody, do you know what is an academic survey? Yeah, an academic survey provides data from our target audience, allowing us to compare our findings to real-world facts and confirm our assumptions. Academic surveys advantages. Of course, when doing the academic surveys, we will get the advantages. Number 1, convenient data gathering, little or no observers, subjectivity cost-friendly, and also high representativeness. Academic survey rules and strategies. Number 1, have a clear purpose. Number 2, keep survey short and focused. Number 3, whenever possible, use close-ended surveys. Number 4, logical ordering. Number 5, keep your responder comfortable. Number 6, objective. And the last but not least, 7, consistent in using the rating scale. That's the rules and strategies doing academic survey. For the next explanation, we will talk about the targeting respondent. How to target the respondent. Number 1, decide the respondent's criteria. Number 2, target the right group. Number 3, figure out the right balance. What's next? We have getting respondents. How to get the respondents? First, social media posts, use questionnaire filling, and number 3, recruit from friends or college. Yeah, that's how to getting respondents. Next, we have how to analyze the result data from academic survey. Number 1, recognize the 4 levels of measurements. Number 2, organize the data by providing a clear guideline. Number 3, interpreting the results of online survey data. Number 4 is the post-tabulation method and filter the results of online survey data to get a picture of the information. Number 5, compare the results of online survey with past data. And number 6, stay focused on correlation. For the next, we have designing and conducting online survey. Number 1, decide the research goal. So, you need to figure out what the purpose of the survey. Number 2, we have area of the topic. For example, you have to find out the advantages or advantages of a topic. Number 3, we have a formulation of the problems. Here, we need to find out several research questions and then find the respondents that really match up with the problem and the research question. Number 4, we have create a list of questions. Yeah, as a researchers, we need to create a lot of lists, a lot of questions in order to find out the answer of the problems that we have. Number 5, distribute and gather responses. Number 6, analyze the results of online survey. Here, we have several ways to analyze the results of online survey. Have a deep understanding with the objectivity and the goals of online surveys. Get a quick overview of the outcome. Separating the respondents based on their characteristic responses, and also examine open text responses carefully for more information. Number 7, write a report. So after finishing all of the things, we need to write a report. So for more understanding about this conducting an academic survey, here I'll give you an example in Seminar Nasional Prodi Bahasa dan Sastra Inggris entitled Digital Ethnography in Humanities Research.
Okay, so I will be talking today about digital humanities in research. Let me minimize this to make it smaller. All right. Okay, so first, as Bu Lina had talked about earlier, what exactly is ethnography? And just to sort of recap what was said earlier before, and hold on, the screen is blocking. Let me just minimize this. Oh, never mind. Okay, what is ethnography? Basically, classic ethnography is when a researcher goes down to the field and speaks to communities to sort of understand how they operate and what are their social behavior essentially. And the main method to sort of examine all of that is through a process of immersion, where the researcher lives amongst these people and sort of like integrates themselves into their lifestyles. And in doing so, they can observe and they can interrogate behaviors directly in person, and allows them to gain deeper insights into how these societies operate. And the primary method in which this understanding is achieved by the researcher is through this process of what we call self-reflexive culture clash. The idea here is that in you seeing other cultures being present that are different than yours, in recognizing those differences, or what we call culture clash, you can then understand, okay, that's how that culture operates very, very differently in relation to yours. And it's one of the fundamental ways in which sort of like ethnography operates essentially. And it really allows researchers to get a very, very deeper understanding of how different cultures and societies work, which is why if you notice, most anthropologists will always study a culture that is often different than their own home culture, because it's very difficult to understand the subtle workings of your own culture because you grew up with all of these things essentially. So with digital ethnography, a similar approach is employed as well. We, instead of studying physical spaces, we study communities and online spaces as well. We also use a method of immersion where we, as a researcher, we immerse ourselves into these online communities. We also observe, and instead of interrogating the behaviors, we interface with them in online communities because we can observe them very, very directly. It also allows us to understand the inner workings of these communities also through self-reflexive culture clash. And generally, it allows us to gain very, very deep insights into the dynamics and nuances of these communities. So that's sort of like a nutshell of what digital ethnography is. So how then do you want to employ this to study online communities? And online communities, as far as a research method is going, is generally a very new thing that social science researchers are still trying to find ways of effective ways of studying. Even though the internet has been around for a very, very long time, social media has sort of accelerated the way that these communities work, because it's a new dynamic, a new foundation that has pretty much only been around for like the last 10 years or so. So when we look at online community spaces, the simple thing is that as researchers, we recognize that essentially people recreate local spaces online. That's really the fundamental way in which a lot of these spaces are created. And online communities operate very, very differently from real world communities. For one thing, the most important part is that people don't really present, you don't know if you're talking to a real person on the other side, because everybody uses pseudonyms or nicknames or what we call handles, or a representation of ourselves. So depending on whether you're using, say, social media or some sort of like a more traditional form of, like, say, a blog or things like that, people tend to not really use their real identity. And even then, real is with quotation marks. You don't know if the person is, even though you can see that there's a picture, there's a profile, the person has like 100 friends and things like that, you don't know if that person is real or not behind it as well. And so that's sort of like one of the main things to sort of like to understand about how these online spaces operate, that it's really very different. And there's no one-to-one communication with another human being. It's very, very indirect as a result of that. Another thing to also understand is that online spaces are what we call pseudo-permanent and asynchronous. Pseudo-permanent in the sense that whatever it is that is posted online will pretty much be there permanently. And when I say permanently, I don't mean in the sense that, oh, if you search for it later on, it will still be there. But sometimes it could be that, like if you see, like, some celebrity post a tweet that says something very bad, and then they delete it later on, but somebody out there will always just screenshot those images. So it's still kind of permanent in that sense. But at the same time, it also means that certain, especially now we're seeing with a lot of new types of social media, things like Snapchat, things like Instagram stories that actually play around with this temporal element. So we're starting to see that shift a little bit. But the general idea here is that a lot of online spaces are what we call asynchronous meeting spaces. So when I want to talk to somebody, usually in real life, I would normally have to be face-to-face with that person. I would either have to meet them in person, I have to call them on the phone. But the idea here is that we have to be in the same place together, what we call synchronous interactions. But whenever you post things online in online spaces, they actually take on an asynchronous form, whereby if I post a question now, somebody can answer it today, somebody can answer it tomorrow, somebody can answer it 2 weeks later, that kind of thing. That's how these discussions take place. So the understanding of what we call conversations is very, very different online as a result of that. So that's another really different fundamental. Another thing also is that most online communities are often purposive and they're focused on certain issues or themes. Whereas in physical communities, you tend to form a community around people that are around you, people that you have access to, either you work together, you live together. But for online communities, it's because people choose to be a part of this community. And therefore, the purpose of that community can vary. It can be anything from issues or themes, or it can even be locations. We all live in the same city in real life. Let's have an online community based on that as well. So all of these things can shift and change based on communities. Membership of the community is another thing that can be that can vary quite a bit. So certain communities can be very open, fluid, and are highly accessible, meaning that if I see this online community, if I want to join the community, all I do is join, or I can just participate directly. Whereas you've got certain communities that are very close, they are kind of exclusive, and they are also very restricted, meaning that some communities will require that you pass through a screening process, you answer certain questions, or you can only join if you meet certain criteria as a result of that. So online communities can vary greatly depending on that as well. But one of the major benefits of online communities is you can overcome a lot of real world restrictions and inequalities. So if you are and this is often why online communities are often used by minority groups, because minority groups often are distributed over a wide space. It's very difficult for them to communicate, to work together or gather together. And so online communities is a very, very effective way for them to organize or to just meet together in an online space. And it's one of the ways in which it can overcome these real world restrictions. But at the same time, it must also be understood that online spaces can also recreate and reinforce these same inequalities. Sometimes people who believe that, oh, we can do certain things, they also bring a lot of their biases, their perspectives, and their stereotypes into the online spaces as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And one of the last things, and this is the reason why online communities can often be seen as having certain issues, is that having diverging from what we know as mainstream behaviors, is that online communities often develop unique behaviors that emerge over time. And this can be in the form of inside jokes, lingo, specialized lingo, or memes. Memes especially, that's the one thing that people often associate with online communities especially. And all of these things form in a way that people outside generally don't understand, and it can be very, very confusing as a result of that. All right. So how then do you want to study these online spaces? So one of the big pushes we're seeing in recent years, especially with the use of social media, is the use of big data to study a lot of these online spaces. And for those of you who are not familiar, big data is the idea that you just collect all of this data, you provide a certain set of keywords or search terms or organizing terms, and then you generate your data based on that. And it's usually combined through a use of algorithms and even AI-based learning techniques. And often, because you have to collect data from various sources and actions, you can either be indirect or indirect. And what I mean by that is that often big data is conducted by a lot of these tech companies, the platform holders, Facebook, Google. These are companies that are doing big data because they have access to all of that information, and they can measure all sorts of things, not just like, oh, if I post something on Facebook, they can get that. They can even measure things like how often do you look at things on Facebook? How often do you sort of share things on Facebook? So all of these things are what they can actually examine quite a bit. And there's a lot of information, and there's of course the big issue of ethics, because sometimes people may not have consented to actually sharing this information. And again, this information is held by private companies and not necessarily researchers. And it's a big question about what can they do with this data. Do they sell them to advertisers? Do they monetize your private data? So that's really one of the big issues that are there. But in terms of research, one of the biggest issues with big data analysis, and this has been shown time and time again in recent years, is that by analyzing data in a very, very aggregated sense like this, you strip away the much needed context to understand why the data says things in a certain way. And more often than not, because you're looking at a large body of data, you tend to only get the majority viewpoints or the majority behaviors that override it, which is why, as you can see from this image here, a lot of times big data analysis using AI often come up with very racist, very stereotypical kind of statements, because that tends to be the majority of points that are available online. So the machine doesn't understand these nuances and then repeats them as part of the research as a result of that. Okay, so another thing to also be mindful of is that the online space has this veil of anonymity. I talked earlier about how, you don't know that the other person is real. And this has very, very big complications that has actually erupted quite a bit in recent years. This was, of course, the most obvious during the American presidential election in 2016, where there were a lot of like these political actors that really came in and started to disrupt and interrupt a lot of these online discussions essentially. But before we get to that, one of the big sort of like forms of online disruption comes from what we call trolls. So trolls essentially are individuals whose main goal is to disrupt and distort online discussions. The goal behind them basically is they just want to make things chaotic. They want to, if somebody's having a civil discussion, their job is to just go in there and they will just sort of like say the opposite things. They'll try to rile people up. They'll make people angry. They want to aggravate people and things like that. So these are people who essentially want to engage in arguing just for the sake of arguing. And it's sort of something that's actually quite well documented. But as I said, we're not starting to see now a transition towards political actors who are actually taking on a lot of these troll-like behaviors. The idea here is that they are going to come into these online spaces where people do political discussions, and they're going to try to disrupt those discussions as a result of that. So these political actors can come in generally two forms. So these terms are not, so you've either going to have paid or radicalized political ideologues. Basically, these are people who are just there to present a certain political stance or political viewpoint. So the first type is what we call cyber troopers. Cyber troopers is, if I'm not mistaken, it's actually a Malaysian term. I think we were the ones that came up with it. And it essentially refers to a political agent, somebody that's either paid by a political party or they are part of a political party. And their job basically is to present that political party in a very, very positive light. So they're supposed to infiltrate these online spaces and they're just supposed to pretend like they are real people. But their job basically is to show that, oh, this is actually, we actually support this party when actually they are part of the party as well. The next type actually is that what we call a diehard. And a diehard is a term that actually came out of the Philippines. In the Philippines, they have this thing called DDH, which refers to Duterte's diehards, meaning that these are groups of people who are so enamored, they are so in love with then candidate Rodrigo Duterte, and they would basically go online and they would go into these online spaces and they would say everything that is in support for that candidate essentially. And on top of that, they do it in a very, very aggressive manner, meaning that people present alternative viewpoints or people present things that make their chosen candidate look bad. They will actually attack them and they will start to sort of like engage with them in a very, very aggressive manner. In Malaysia, the term that we use is what we call macai, which is it's a bizarre term. It's a term that has become quite universal here, but it's actually a term that comes from, if I'm not mistaken, Mandarin. It means son of a horse, and it's supposed to indicate that this is a person just blindly follows orders from people above them essentially. So that's a term that we use here essentially that refers to people who are very, very dedicated to a political party. They may not necessarily, it's very, we cannot really determine whether or not they are paid by the party or they are part of the party, but these people generally are so, they are incredibly zealous in the way that they defend their party in that sense. All right. So a lot of these political actors, sometimes they are financed by various political entities. They can sometimes be foreign or they can be local. In the American election in 2016, there was a lot of documented evidence that there were foreign actors out of Russia, especially, that were trying to interfere with the elections by posing as Americans and trying to disrupt a lot of their online spaces as a result of that. And they do this by masquerading or pretending to be a local member of the community. And generally, the main goal of all of these political actors is that they want to shift the expectations and perceptions of the majority view. So if you get enough of these cyber troopers in a particular space and you get them to engage, to start posting, to start liking things, you can create the perception that actually, okay, this is what the majority of the people here are talking about, when in actuality, they could actually be all these political actors as a result of that. One other new technique that we're sort of seeing, as again, this came about from the American elections, was the use of what we call false flag type operations, whereby you have a cyber trooper that rather than they come in and they are sort of like these diehard supporters of a party, they pose as members of the opposing side, basically, and they basically amplify all the bad behaviors associated with that viewpoint. So if you know this party has certain values about them, for instance, if you believe that this party is going to, like in Malaysia, you know, we were seeing a lot of this as well, whereby we've got people who try to pretend to represent a certain party, and then they try to highlight a lot of the most negative points about that party by pretending to be a real person there as well. And that will make people who see that, who will then falsely believe that, oh, members of that party believe so and so, when in actuality, it is not the truth. So that's another thing that we're seeing taking place quite a bit as well. Okay, so based on that, now let me just sort of like reorient the discussion, and let's take a look at the differences between social media and online communities, essentially. All right. So social media communities are what we refer to a community that is built on social media. So it can be anything from a Facebook page, a Facebook group, you know, Twitter, Instagram, basically any form of social media that allows people to self-organize in a certain way. So communities through social media tend to be very, very public. They are very, very accessible. It's either you can search for them very easy, you can just join them whenever you want. They also have very highly fluid membership, meaning that people are there. If they want to participate, they can. If they want to leave, they just leave. It's often what we call a turnstile kind of membership. People come and go on a regular basis as well. And you generally have a lot of visitors to these communities. So usually, say if you're part of a Facebook group and something, a topic, a post comes up and it's very interesting and it goes viral, then you get a lot of people come in to view it and they engage in that discussion. But once that issue dies down, they often tend to leave. They don't become a part of the community. So these are what we call temporal visitors, essentially. So a lot of big communities on social media tend to have very, very high traffic with a large amount of reactions and responses. So there's a lot of information that you can sort of see flowing in and out of these spaces, essentially. But because of the high fluidity of membership and easy access, there is actually very little sense of community. And more often than not, the whatever sense of community that you have here is going to be based off real world affinities or ideologies. People don't go to these communities because they feel connected to the people in the community. They just feel that we share the same ideals and therefore we want to be part of these groups, essentially. And as a result of that, you start to notice this thing called hit and run commentary. Basically, you've got people who come in, they post certain things, but then they don't bother to respond. So you don't really get discussions that go on. You often get people who will post something maybe that's inflammatory or something that is meant to antagonize certain people, but then they don't engage in deeper discussion. And that's why a lot of discussions in social media, if you notice, sometimes they tend to just peter out very, very quickly. If it does have any sort of like longevity, it's probably only like a few hours or maybe a day. Then after that, the discussion disperses entirely. And so that's really what we're seeing. And communities and social media communities, of course, are heavily influenced by trolls and foreign political actors, essentially. They are always going to be able to sort of like, because it's very difficult to gatekeep who can or cannot post in these places. A lot of interference comes from these groups, essentially. And I can probably write an entire paper talking about the different techniques and methods that they use to go into it. Okay, and as a result of that, any sort of discussion that we have in these social media communities tend to be very sporadic, meaning that sometimes it can be big, sometimes it can be small. It can also be very detached. People sometimes don't talk to other people. They often just spout, you know, very, very big ideas or posts, but they don't really engage with others. And it can also be kind of alienating. You know, sometimes people are not hesitant to yell, to sort of like to really attack people in a very personal manner, because again, you don't really know who these people are. You don't see yourself as part of a community. And because you just treat everybody as being strangers, people very easy, people find it very easy to be very mean to other people online, especially in these social media communities. Okay, so online communities, on the other hand, are what we call things like, you know, closed Facebook groups, whereby not everybody can go in, or even WhatsApp groups, you know, WhatsApp, Telegram groups, where, you know, only certain people are in there. It's all technically private. And of course, you've got traditionally the online forums, you know, so you have things like Reddit, 4chan. In Malaysia, our most popular forum is Lawyat, and I believe in Indonesia, your most popular forum is Kaskus, but again, my information on that is quite old. That was what, during my growing up years, like maybe like 10 years ago, that was the most popular. I'm not sure if it still is, but from what I understand, it's supposed to be still quite popular as a result of that. Okay, so these forums, if you're not familiar with what a forum is, it's basically an online space. Think of it as like, say, a very traditional form of social media where everybody can post it. It's what we call a message board or a bulletin board, where people can post up a topic, and other people can then post replies to it as well. So it tends to be where it's a natural place in which discussions can really take place in a very public, closed public setting, essentially. So online communities generally are often private. They often have some degree of gatekeeping for membership. So sometimes it could just be as simple as getting people to sign up for an account, or sometimes you need even more than that. It's also often heavily moderated, meaning there's always an administrator or moderator whose job is to monitor. And if there are people who are breaking the rules or the regulations of these places, they often get either temporarily banned or they just get kicked out entirely. Online communities, especially big ones, tend to be very, very stable because, you know, they have a certain number of people that as long as they share certain ideals and values, that they will all remain there. But if something happens, then it might disperse. You also start to see a very robust community, a community that can pull through even if things happen, and they often evolve with the times as things change over time, essentially. Okay, and as a result, that a lot of these online communities have a very, very strong sense of community, and sometimes they're often built around a specific topic, issue, or theme, or hobby, or whatever. And because people are in this closed space and they do sort of like communicate with other people that they see as sort of like sharing the same values, these can often transcend into sort of like something beyond the community. You know, people can develop friendships, relationships as a result of that, and that's something that has been widely documented based on this. And so whatever discussions that we see in these online communities tend to be a lot more in-depth, and people actually have to think about the long-term effects. So previously in social media communities, what I call hit and run community, commentary. People go in, they post something, and then they leave and they never come back again, or they come back much, much later, and whatever they posted before, people have forgotten. But when you're posting inside a closed online community, people actually can remember, because again, these are the same people that you're talking to roughly the same group of people. And so people will remember what you said before. And so there is this idea that if you post, if you have a habit or a pattern of behavior of, you know, posting certain things that are bad or insulting certain people, then people will remember, and then they will respond to you accordingly as a result of that. And as a result of that, there is a certain sense of decorum that is observed and also strongly moderated by the people there as well. So that's really one of the main strengths of these things. And I think for any of you who are ever in sort of like any sort of like Facebook or WhatsApp groups, basically, or group chats, you'll notice that these sort of behaviors are naturally sort of instilled as a result of that. And because these communities do have gatekeeping for membership, it's a lot more rigid. Trolls and foreign actors can actually be spotted quite easier, because for the most part, you know, if you are a paid cyber trooper and your goal is to infiltrate this space and then to sort of like mess with the discussions that are taking place in there, you actually have to go the extra mile to involve yourself in a lot of other discussions, which a lot of these paid actors usually will not want to do. So they just focus on, okay, I need to post a certain amount of, like, you know, political posts in a certain day, and people can see right through, because they realize that, oh, we're a community that talks about these things, you are new and you are not engaging on anything else, and all you're doing is posting political stuff. So it's quite obvious that you're here as a political actor. So that's really how communities are become a lot more like I said, robust and resilient in defending against these sort of like foreign interference, essentially. And it's especially more obvious if a lot of these political actors post things that are divergent from the majority viewpoints in there as well. It'd be very obvious to go like, why are you even posting in here in that sense? Okay, and so because these are all closed spaces and every interaction that you see is viewable by all, and it is not affected by algorithms or filter bubbles. So that's another major thing that's often plaguing social media as a result of that. So what exactly are the filter bubbles and echo chambers? So essentially, let me just talk a little bit about how the effects of curation of social media are influencing the way that we view the world. Okay, so the idea here is that people's worldviews and perceptions are heavily affected by media that they have access to. This was widely documented by Job Gerbner in his cultivation theory, whereby he believed that if people, or what he called the mean world syndrome, whereby if somebody watches a lot of television, if they watch more than 5 hours in a day, they will have a certain, they will be cultivated by that media and have a certain view of the world that is different from everyone else, because their perception of reality comes from their exposure to television as a result of that. And while that was focused on television, a lot of those same effects can be seen in other forms of media as a result of that. So a lot of these things are looking really as long as you use that media, you're going to be cultivated with certain issues as well. But of course, the world of George Gerbner in the 60s is very different than the world we live in today, thanks to AI algorithms and of course individually controlled social media, whereby instead of when you say you are exposed to social media, you're not exposed, your social media exposure is going to be different from everyone else's, because with social media, it allows you to curate your experience. You can choose who do you want to follow, who do you want to watch. Any content that you don't like, you can downvote it. You can say that you don't want to watch it ever again. And so that's what you choose. And then at the same time, there's AI that learns from your behaviors and be like, oh, this person, you like certain type of content, I'm going to recommend more content that's similar in scope to that. And so, and I also start to downplay everything else that doesn't match what it is that you like. And as a result of that, people's worldviews are actually very, very insulated as a result of that, because from the AI learning your behaviors, it is curating what you are exposed to. And while in your head, you feel that, oh, I'm still exposing myself to everything. But again, AI, big data, all these technology giants, they are controlling what you're actually seeing. And people are inadvertently creating individualized silos for themselves, meaning that this is the little bubble that they live in, and they are not aware that actually it's a small portion of what the rest of the world is essentially. And this is basically where we come to the two major effects, which is echo chambers and filter bubbles. So echo chambers essentially is when an individual is exposed to certain viewpoints and perspectives that skews their worldviews. The idea here is that if I only make, so for instance, just say I'm in Malaysia and I only like posts or I make posts that are related to say that are pro-government. Okay, so I like the government basically. A lot of the people that I follow are pro-government. A lot of the things that I do are supporting the government. The AI sees that and then it decides that, oh, this person likes the government. Let's throw them more content that's based on people who love the government. So they start to share people who support the government. They share like, you know, they suggest that I join various groups that are related to supporting the government and things like that. And they constantly do that over and over. And at the same time, it also it also learns from my behavior and compares them to other people with similar behaviors. And they start to notice that actually people who are pro-government will naturally not want to hear any anti-government stuff. So they will then give me all the pro-government links, all the pro-government content, but they will actually start to remove all the anti-government stuff because they know I'm probably not going to click on it. I'm probably not going to like it. But the thing is, by doing that, it actually gives the impression that, oh, everybody loves the government. Everybody out there is pro-government because I've searched on my social media and all I see are pro-government stuff. I'm not seeing any anti-government, which means that nobody hates the government, nobody disagrees with the government. And as a result of that, that is how their entire worldview has been skewed as a result. That they will start to falsely believe that whatever they see on social media is actually representative of the real world, but in actuality, they represent a very, very small section, and there's a whole other world that's out there that they're completely unaware of in that sense. So that is basically what we call a algorithm or AI-supported echo chamber. The other one, which is filter bubbles, is when a person sort of like does things on their own, whereby they either actively or they indirectly define their media access. So it becomes to be something as simple like, you know, if you use YouTube or even if you go on Facebook, for every post that you see on your wall, there's always the option there. If you click on the three dots at the top right, it can actually determine, do I want to see more content like this or do I want to see less content like this? Do I want to see similar topics and things like that? So that's basically that's what we call filtering. You are filtering the kind of content that you're going to be shown, that you're going to be given access to as a result of that. And because of that, you actually you create a bubble for yourself where all you see is whatever it is that you filtered. And sometimes, you know, it makes sense. You know, if you're the whole point of social media is that you get to pick and choose what it is that you want to consume. And so it makes complete sense that, yes, I don't want to see things that I want. I'm obviously going to filter them out. But when you're thinking about political deliberation, it's very, very important that everybody have access to everything in equal parts. It's like you need to hear sort of like positive viewpoints. You also need to hear negative viewpoints so that you, as somebody who's participating in democracy, have the full picture of what is going on. And filter bubbles and echo chambers are very damaging in that respect because they really limit the way that people are exposed to all of these alternative viewpoints, essentially. Okay, so how then do we now want to problematize online communities? Okay, so as I said before, online communities develop deeper ties, relationship between members. And as a result of that, they become very, very impenetrable to outsiders. So the development of insider lingo, in-jokes, meme references are some things that only fellow community members can understand. So if you see this little diagram here, if you're not Malaysian, it is going to be something that makes absolutely no sense. Basically, this basically is a translation for a term that has become something that I think most Malaysians understand, but it's completely alien language for everyone else. It's basically called Makau Hijau, which was a joke term that came from a video where there was this kid who was like, he was being bullied or something like that, and he just, in the midst of just being attacked, he just sort of blurted it out. It's a sentence that makes absolutely no sense, but now it has sort of evolved that most Malaysians, when they use that term, so they translate it to "your mom is green." Again, it's a sentence that makes absolutely no sense. But for any Malaysians, it pretty much means that, oh, it's meant to be a sarcastic remark, to say that, oh, I don't really treat whatever you're saying as being serious. I'm going to use this completely ridiculous statement. And one very good example of this was that there was this recent case that happened in Malaysia where I think there was this popular internet celebrity who said something about Malaysia, and people just kept posting this on that screen, and people were just confused as to what's going on in here, essentially. But that's really how this is an example of how these sort of like insider lingo can really make it difficult for other people to come in, which is why Malaysian communities, online communities especially, are completely impenetrable for people from the outside coming in. So that's one very good example of that. And so when you want to do digital ethnography, it's very, very important that you understand these nuances, because these are things that you need to really immerse yourself. You need to involve yourself in these communities to understand how all of these things work. You know, what's the context that you will use this? How does this change the way that the community behaves? And it's very, very easy for researchers who don't spend enough time in these spaces to misunderstand these jokes, the intents, and sometimes certain communities actually promote trolling behavior. There's a certain level of trolling that they sort of tolerate. But if you as a researcher go in and you don't understand that, that nuance, you can actually misinterpret it as a result of that. And another major problem that is really quite symptomatic of online communities, and it's a wonder that it's still here today, is that a lot of online communities tend to develop highly problematic and deviant antisocial traits. And this is something that has been around for a long time. More often than not, online communities are people who use it as a form of escapism to sort of like move away from their often dreary physical lives. And from what we've been seeing from, like, you know, the 90s and even the 2000s, a lot of the same issues are still present, because the majority of online community people are going to be often young adult males. There is often very rampant misogyny, sexism, nihilism, extremism that can grow unchecked in these community, because these are people who all share the same values, and they start to reinforce and support each other. And because they recognize that an online space is sort of like secondary to the mainstream and popular culture spaces, they sort of indulge in a lot of these. They indulge and reinforce these deviant values that they feel is taboo elsewhere. So that's where a lot of these communities do have problems, where a lot of these very deviant cultures also tend to grow in very, very large forms as a result of that. Okay, so how then do you then want to sort of immerse yourself into these online communities? And this is a major part if you do want to embark on this research, is that very similar to traditional ethnography, it's very important that you immerse yourself to really fully understand it. But where with traditional ethnography, there's a clear separation between the field and your own personal spaces. So even if you're living in a village, you know that if you go out in the village, that yes, this is your field workspace, but when you go home or you go to whatever place that you call your home, that is your own private space that is separate from it as well. And you can therefore disassociate from the field and also your space. But when you're doing things in an online environment, that separation is not so clear-cut, because a lot of these online platforms are what we call context agnostic. What I refer to it here basically is that if you're doing some research into online communities that are based on Facebook, and you yourself use Facebook, when you go into these online communities, and yet you go back to your own personal online feeds as well, they can be very indistinguishable from each other. And as a result of that, if you are exposed to a lot of these deviant values and cultures for a long time, they can subtly begin to affect your worldviews just by simple exposure, essentially. And so it's very, very important. And one way to sort of block or stop this is to basically engage in self-reflexivity. It's a way for researchers to really maintain their objectivity and to avoid being influenced or being cultivated by exposure in this sense. And one of the ways to do it is basically to document your experiences, track your thoughts and your values, and to see how they are changing as you're collecting your data. So again, memoing and journaling is a very, very important component to make sure that you do very effective digital ethnography as well. Okay, so how then do you, so I'm just going to give you guys a very simple sort of like run through of how to do digital ethnography of online public spaces. This is not the only way of doing it. This is just one way, especially when you're doing it online public spaces as well. Okay, so I would like to split it up into 5 main steps basically. So, and again, this is referring to public online communities. These are communities that exist in a public space, so you don't really need to request for membership. You don't need to sort of like enter them in a way that requires you to ask permission and things like that. So it's all entirely public. Okay, so you got 5 main ways, which is scope out the platform, map out the discourse, immerse yourself, document your findings, and then code the space. So first, what I mean by scope out the platform is that you need to sort of understand how the platform operates. So you need to determine your search parameters to identify where the discussion spaces are, the hotspots for activity are as well. So this can include things like figuring out the hashtags to use, what are the search terms, what are certain groups you want to follow specifically. Then you want to demarcate the hotspots to know when the discussions are taking place and to see if there are certain periods where discussions happen as well. So you need to see what topics are being discussed and what are the potential biases that are present here. So this is now, you're still at a pilot stage. You're sort of like trying to understand the space essentially. You don't have to go too deep into the data collection yet. Then you need to also identify your platform affordances. So what are platform affordances? Essentially, these are the structures from the platforms in place that shape discourse. So it could be something as simple as say, how your interactions, whether your interactions are anonymous or with real profiles. So for instance, if you're looking at Twitter essentially is Facebook, people basically present themselves as real profiles. So Facebook is what you call a real kind of environment. You're talking to real people ostensibly, basically. Whereas on Twitter, people tend to use accounts, but again, because Twitter is quite a public space, they also are somewhat real, but people can also use pseudonyms as a result of that. Whereas on online communities, we consider those to be anonymous environments, and usually here everybody assumes that, oh, everybody is a pseudonym, everybody isn't who they say they are, and so you can assume that people in here are adopting a cynical approach where they just believe that everybody is hiding behind an alias, which is totally normal and acceptable. Okay, then of course you have to think about how is it that you can interact with other people or how you can interact in the discussion. So things like social network, what are the social network options that you have? Can you private message other people? What kind of content can you share and provide here in that sense? Like for instance, can you do likes? Can you retweet? Can you do reactions? Can you upvote or downvote certain posts? What moderation options are there? Can you report certain things? Are the moderators actually taking an active role in moderating the spaces? Is there a way to private message other people? Can users respond to each other? Can they edit their own posts? Editing is actually a very major component as well. So all of these things, you should probably try to understand to sort of see how the discussions are shaped as a result of that. So very, very important to sort of like figure that out. And it's actually also very important that even if you're studying a space that you are quite familiar with, that you sort of like document this. So at least you know very clearly what it is that you're looking for when you actually start collecting your data. Okay. Second part is that you want to map out your discourse. You want to sort of like understand what are the topics that are being discussed. So think about how is it that topics are broached. Do people share news articles? Do people share things that they see from their WhatsApp or things like that? So just an idea of how all of these things are discussed. Then also try to think about how non-political discussions are taking place and how those are sometimes tied to political issues as well. So these are things that you can take a look at. Also try to think about who participates in these discussions, who are the key people that are there. Certain people will often just be present in any sort of discussion. Just say this person really likes public transportation. So anytime there's a topic on public transportation, they will always be there talking about it essentially. So you need to then try to figure out what are the different ideologies and perspectives that are being presented by various groups of people. Next is that what we call the life of a post or a thread, meaning that whenever an issue is being discussed, how long is it sort of like active and people continue to post and engage in that topic? In social media, they can be very, very brief. It can be like maybe an hour. Whereas on forums, it can last days even, if something is really very hot or it's an issue that is ongoing, people will come in for a long period of time. And it's important to understand what kind of topics can get that kind of activity and what are the ones that don't. And it really depends on the space that you're looking at, essentially. Another thing that also is worth looking into is that what are the times that certain topics are hot? Generally for online forums in Malaysia, usually the hotspots will always be during lunchtime, because then the people on their lunch breaks, they check out the forums, they start to post stuff. So forum activity is usually the highest during lunchtime breaks. And previously in Malaysia, a lot of our political cyber troopers followed a 9 to 5 schedule, meaning that exactly at 9 o'clock, all of the posts come in. Then right before 5 o'clock, all of the posts come in as well. So we recognize that these cyber troopers generally were working 9 to 5 jobs, essentially. Okay. You should also think about examine how are administrators or moderators moderating these spaces. What topics are allowed to be published? What are the keywords that are censored automatically? How do they sort of like engage with moderating this space? Do they actively participate, or do they just silently ban people and delete and censor stuff on their own? Do they use automatic or manual techniques, things like profanity filters, auto bans, and things like that? So these are the things that you should start to map out as a result of that. Then the next step, this is the part where you actually start to collect your data. You start to immerse yourself into the data. So the way to immerse is basically you start to catalog the keywords, lingo, common phrases, and just to, again, get an understanding of the context of how all of these things work. It's also very, very important, especially if you're not familiar with these spaces, to examine the archive posts for context and reference. So for instance, that Makau Hijau thing there that I mentioned from the earlier slide, you probably have to dig very, very far into earlier posts to figure out what that means exactly. If you're lucky, sometimes you can see somebody ask the same question and then you can refer to that for the answer. But if you cannot, then you might have to reach out to a member of the community to sort of ask them questions to get an understanding of how all these things operate. So this is, again, how digital ethnography can be triangulated with other forms of qualitative research, essentially. Okay. You should also then, of course, check the life cycle of discussions to see, and you also, meaning that when discussions take place, how is it that the community reacts to the discussion? Do they actively post? Do they constantly post stuff? What kind of interactions take place? And then you should also sort of like monitor or follow these things as though you are a part of the community. You check in every day, you check in every few hours. And the idea here is that this varies greatly depending on the community. Certain, like the Laureate forums, for example, is a very, very vibrant and active community. You can, if you check it, if you refresh pages between every 5 minutes, you will get a whole different set of discussions that take place. It's very, very active with a lot of people. So your monitoring activities would have to be more frequent there. But if you're examining a more, say, a smaller community that is a bit more dispersed, so the discussions may be like somebody will make a thread like once a day, and then the discussions will last for like a few days as well, then you can monitor at a much slower pace. But the idea here is that you need to develop a routine to monitor these spaces, essentially. Okay. Next, of course, is that I would highly recommend, and again, this is more of a guideline, avoid posting or interacting with the community. And again, this is because as a researcher, you want to, these are public spaces, so you don't really have to announce that you're monitoring them, essentially. But it's also important that, if you do shed light that they are being monitored, sometimes it can invite unwanted attention. And again, most communities tend to not have this problem, but I'm talking more about very, very antagonistic communities, communities that engage in a lot of collective behavior, of cyberbullying and things like that. So if you sort of like indicate that you are monitoring them or you're examining them, that might invite unwanted attention. So I would really recommend not exposing yourself unless you have to, essentially. And again, in certain cases, when you participate in these communities, sometimes, as a researcher, you can see certain things that are being posted that really go against your own values, or you feel that there's something incredibly problematic there and you do want to engage. I would say please resist from engaging in this public space, because generally, again, some of these people could just be trolls, or they could not really be serious. And it's often just there just to instigate a certain discussion or a certain response. So instead of engaging in that way, I would just say memo or journal these experiences, essentially. So that's actually more important. And that's where I want to end this part here. Basically, make sure that you do daily journals of self-reflection. Memo everything that you experience. And please, please always self-reflect on what you're observing and how it is changed, how it is so different from your own worldview. So that if you do your digital ethnography that lasts for 3 months, if I look at the at the memos at the start and look at the memos at the end, I can see, okay, how have your own beliefs changed as a result of that? So that's a very, very good process that you should really try to do to maintain objectivity as you're collecting all of this data. Okay. Next, of course, you've got document. A document is another very key important component. As I said before, things on the internet are permanent, but at the same time, they can also be deleted without notice, and it's your job to make them permanent. So first, you also need to make sure that you save all the links for everything that you need. Please make sure that you also take down, profiles. Certain user accounts might be crucial for your analysis. And if you're doing things on social networks, you can actually make use of a social networking app that can allow you to map out different relationships between different accounts. So it's a certain way that if you're studying, say, troll or cyber trooper networks, it can allow you to actually map out their relationships and their hotspots for activity. When you also want to, on top of storing the URL links, you should also try to screenshot anything that you're using for safekeeping, because you never know, especially things on social media where people can just delete their posts anytime. Screenshotting, make sure that you always have a copy of that you can use. And you should also take note of any quantifiable contents from this, anything from the number of views, the number of reactions, replies. And that's especially important because the point that you take them will be the value that you've taken at the time. So if I see the number of views today and I look at it maybe 2 months later, it's probably going to be different. So it's very, very important that you document these things with screenshots, essentially. Okay, there is an alternative where you can use a web data scraper. It's a special software that allows you to just sort of read whatever's on the screen and extract all that information for you so you can analyze it directly. But that one is a little bit of a mixed bag because it may work with certain sites and it works very well with forums, but it's incredibly problematic if you try with social media. Social media has a lot of things that make it a little bit unwieldy, and data scrapers, there are ways to get data scrapers to work with it, but it requires some programming knowledge and it's a little bit more complicated. So again, if you can, that's great, but if you cannot, I think that's totally fine. But again, this is the kind of work that has to go in to sort of collecting data for digital ethnography. So how then do you sort of so the final part here basically is that how do you then collect all this data and how do you code this data essentially? So after you have enough exposure to these spaces, you feel that you have a good grasp of what the context is and everything of how this all operates, you can start to code the discussions. Basically, you start to collect your data and you can start to analyze for teams. So normally I would recommend that people either use critical discourse analysis or thematic analysis, essentially. Both are, I would recommend that you use them depending on the certain situation. So you would use CDA if it's a very, very large community and you are tracking very, very different discussions that are taking place across the community. So CDA is more effective there for you to sort of look at things in a much more larger space. Whereas you would use thematic analysis if you're looking at much more a smaller community where a lot of the discussions are focused on smaller posts or threads. So it's much more easier to manage it there. But again, it really depends on which approach you're more comfortable with, essentially. And the coding that you're doing should be focused on identifying the themes that are being discussed, what are the patterns of posting behavior, and what are the reactions and responses to current issues and events that are taking place. Okay, and so you can also use this to, of course, profile community members. You can identify who are the key influencers or core discussants and how they affect the discussions that are taking place. If there are certain people that, like, say in a forum, and this person is like, it's considered a senior in that forum, and they post certain things. Do people respond to them with reverence and things like that? So these are things that you should really keep in mind. You should also start to profile the average person in the community, because that will tell you that, oh, this is what the average person in the community feels for certain things. So these are things that you should try. And then finally, if you can, again, this is something that is very, very difficult, try to identify any suspicious or like troll or cyber trooper accounts that will help you, because it's a good way to sort of map that out essentially and to see how they are trying to interfere with discussions that are taking place. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through very, very quickly a case study of digital ethnography of Malaysia, basically. Okay, I'm going to look at the online political spaces in Malaysia and how these online spaces reflect offline divisions. So I'm going to take a quick look at 3 different online communities and then to see what are the 3 different ethnic undertones underneath them. And then we're going to ask the question of, is this a proxy for public opinion? Basically, if I just examine all of these 3 spaces, can I believe that this is what the majority of Malaysians have on a certain issue as well? Okay, so first let's take a look at Facebook. Basically, it is what we call the largest political discourse space, and the majority of online discussions take place on Facebook. It's spread out across the platform, and usually it's revolving around, news sites, political figures, special public, political, ethno-religious pages or groups. That's usually where all these hotspots are essentially. A lot of the spaces are divided by language. So they tend to either be in Malay, Chinese, or English, essentially. And a lot of these different spaces reflects the dominant ethno-religious community practices and political leanings of the people in that community. Meaning that, you know, these people who share these affinities, they will all gravitate to these spaces, essentially. But what's very interesting is that even though these communities are divided from each other, you can actually start to see what are the divisions within the community as they start to discuss things, they start to sort of like change their views and things like that. So that's one thing that you can examine in that sense. And one good thing about Facebook is that you can see a wide range of Malaysians from various socioeconomic and geographic backgrounds. Basically across Malaysians, they all make use of Facebook. Facebook is the #1 social media in the country, so this of course makes sense. There is of course a very high presence of potential trolls and cyber troopers here, especially in political discussions where they always try to overwhelm or antagonize different viewpoints. You know, you see if there is this post about a particular politician in there, you will see people coming in there just posting one letter saying that I support you, you're doing great, everything, that kind of stuff. And they will do that in like the hundreds, basically, just trying to give the impression that these are the people that support them as well. We're seeing a lot of that in that sense. And on top of that, we're starting to see also a spiral of silence effect, whereby these certain accounts are very aggressive at attacking any dissenting viewpoint. So back to that, if you have this politician that everybody supports, suddenly one person says that actually this person is corrupt, why you are supporting him, you will start to see like an avalanche of people just coming in, attacking them. They're like, what do you know? This person is doing this thing, that kind of thing. And then they will downvote, they'll put all sorts of negative reactions to that person in a bid to basically dissuade other discussions from coming in and to show that, oh, actually, this person is an outlier, he's not the main person. So we're seeing a lot of that, especially in these Facebook spaces. And because Facebook is, again, a very sort of like open platform, that Facebook themselves don't really moderate that much. There's very limited moderation from the platform and even a lot of the administrators that we see, essentially. Okay. Next up, of course, let's take a look at Twitter. So Twitter is a much more open discursive space for Malaysians. Echo chambers are not really easy to form because Twitter is a lot more open in the way, you know, if you want to search for something, you can easily search it through the use of hashtags and whatnot. But filter bubbles, of course, can still come in, especially, you know, because you can, of course, block people, you can also follow certain people, and that is a form of filter bubbles that can happen as well. But it is a lot more diverse, you know, it's a very, there's a lot of different angles and perspectives that are present in Twitter as a result of that. It is still predominantly an English-speaking space, so mainly English-speaking Malaysians will use it, but we're starting to see a lot more Malay language representation coming into Twitter, which is a good sign, of course, because the majority of discourse tends to be in Malay, essentially. And so one of the good things about Twitter is that whatever trending hashtag you see can actually serve as a decent barometer of public opinion, because you're starting to see like thousands, like hundreds of thousands or millions of tweets on a particular thing. So that's actually a good way to gauge public opinion on a certain issue. Now, the main problem that we're seeing with Twitter is that Twitter, unlike Facebook, where technically everybody should have Facebook, Twitter really only is catered towards certain personalities. And these are what we call public personalities whose main goal is that they want to broadcast their thoughts to the public, essentially, you know. But that's essentially the point of a tweet. You know, on Facebook, if you post something to your wall, it's really to your friends and family. But on Twitter, whatever you tweet is really designed for everyone to hear. And so it's a lot more, it takes a certain kind of personality to engage in that way. And so people on Twitter generally always post it themselves, which really makes it difficult for cyber troopers to operate and influence discussions. But of course, as I said before, only strong, extroverted, educated, and very aggressive personality types will inhabit this space. And then they also start to dominate the discourse, essentially. And it's very difficult to measure what we call bystander effects. You know, people who just are in social media and they don't necessarily post things, they just sort of follow things around, they lurk in places, but we don't really see a lot of that on Twitter, or it's very difficult to document that on Twitter. And because you need a special personality type to engage on Twitter, it's very difficult to say that people on Twitter are representative of the everyday Malaysian, essentially. You know, people who are not very educated, people who are not in these groups generally will not use Twitter, essentially. So that's one of the main problems with Twitter in that sense. So the last one I want to talk about here basically is the Lawyat.net forums, which is sort of like, it's a very, very large synchronous Malaysian-based internet forum, which is a weird thing to say for a forum, but the laureate forums are so large, there are on average 10,000 concurrent users per day, meaning that there are 10,000 people just using the site on a daily basis, and they basically talk about anything under the sun, and it's almost like real-time conversation. And so the ethnography that I use for this is really focused on the loosely moderated Kopitiam subforum. It's basically what we call the off-topic forum, whereby anything under the sun can be discussed here as well. There's basically no moderation here in that sense. And so it's a good way. And because of that, because it's so much activity and people are just like to post about things that are happening, just pretty much happening to them or in general, we'll see a lot of like new threads opening every hour. It's actually a very useful barometer to see what are the major issues that are affecting urban Malaysians. The people who generally use Layat tend to be urban Malaysians. So the entire space is predominantly male. They are English speaking with a mixed presence of various Malaysian ethnicities. So it's also quite a diverse space as well. And I would argue that it's actually one of the more open spaces for political discourse, because all threads that are posted are viewable by all. There's it's very hard to tell whether there's a dominance from any sort of like political leanings in there as well. And it's a forum, and of course, it's kind of anonymous, and therefore there's a strong presence of trolls and cyber troopers. But because it is an online community, and most often than not, these cyber troopers tend to focus on political issues, they are quite easily identified and then called out as a result of that. Because this is such a huge community where you can talk about anything under the sun. It used to be a tech community, but you can sell your car, you can buy properties on this thing. It's really very wide space as a result of that if you see cyber troopers just focusing on these political issues, it's very clear that they are cyber troopers essentially. And you also have a very, very dedicated moderating team that heavily enforces and tries to remove covert and disruptive operators as a result of that. So it's really a very good, so I would say that a place like Laoyat is actually very effective to see a wide range of political viewpoints that actually breaks through most echo chambers limitations. So basically, from what I presented here, basically you can see, like social media, a lot of problems with discussion, but a lot very accessible, whereas forums is the other way around. So these are then let me just go through the platform effects on worldviews essentially. So Facebook, of course, is the one where people are the most susceptible to warped worldviews. The idea here that Facebook users are real people makes people believe that, oh, these are all real people, these are all real values that I'm looking at. But the online communities in Facebook are very disparate, they're very separated from each other. And as a result of that, it's easy to form siloed echo chambers as a result of that. So people can have completely different worldviews as a result of that. Twitter, of course, allows for more open discourse with very little cyber trooper interference, but it is a platform that privileges wordsmiths. You have the 140 character limit. I think that's more already now. And as a result of that, only people who can articulate themselves well, which tends to be very educated people, will do that. And people who really don't want to live a very public life, they will often view Twitter as being a very elitist space. So that's one of the main stigmas with Twitter essentially. Okay, the Layat forums then is a very divisive space with a lot of cyber troopers, but within its chaos, it's actually quite easy to see real people and to understand different perspectives. And one of the main problems with Layat, and I would really urge you if anybody wants to study online community, this is really one thing that you have to be very mindful of, is that a lot of them tend to be male-dominated spaces with very strong sexist and misogynistic undertones. So that's one thing that you have to be mindful of. But because the format of a forum really allows for discussions to remain public, there's very little interference from algorithms and even filter bubbles as a result of that. So how then do you sort of like analyze these spaces? I know I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to try to wrap this up very, very quickly. Online spaces in Malaysia tend to reflect their offline ethnic divisions. People from similar groups tend to follow personalities based on accessibility and cultural proximity. If we share the same language, I see that your account name has a similar one to mine, that kind of thing, and we also like the same topics. And people also tend to sort of curate their own online experiences, and because they start to do that, they build walls amongst themselves. And so in a way, having agency that is afforded by online media has really trained us to really only see what we want to see and reject everything else. And that has very, very damaging effects on democracy, essentially. And so social media spaces all suffer from filter bubbles that create mono-thought communities that reinforce and entrench parochial perspectives. People don't really want to see beyond the little narrow spaces that they've created for themselves. And the thing is, for a lot of people, this is actually very convenient. It's what we call cognitively congruent and reaffirming. Because if I'm in a community where everybody likes the same things, it can validate your own opinions and can reassure you that what you're saying is actually real and other people share it as well. And people always think that I'm not alone in thinking that way, so I therefore am correct. And this is how racialized thought, ethnic stereotypes, deviant and divisive thoughts can start to poison people's perceptions as a result of that. And so that really goes to the idea of the comfort of filter bubbles and echo chambers. The idea here is that online forum communities are much more open than social media, but they're also incredibly esoteric online cultures and spaces that really alienates people who are not tech savvy or people who don't want to be super involved. For the average person who just wants to scroll through social media, that's very, very easy to do. If you want to get involved in an online forum community, that's very, very difficult to get into and also very alienating. It requires a lot of involvement as well. The heavy use of coded language and memes is a huge barrier for entry for a lot of people. And so even though there are a lot of cyber troopers and trolls in these online forum communities, and you can sort of recognize them, it's actually very mentally tiring to separate the reality from the manufactured fiction. And so even though forum communities are actually better for sort of like open discussion, it's actually not a great place if you're just a regular person that just wants to talk about stuff on a regular basis. Because breaking out of your respective echo chambers is not an easy feat. It requires a lot of mental stamina and fortitude to overcome the cognitive dissonance that you're going to face, that, basically, everybody has this idea that, okay, this is my view of the world, I believe that this is correct. And if something comes in that changes their view and says that actually your view is wrong, it's actually very difficult for some people, because some of these views could be very fundamental to how you see yourself and the world around you. And if somebody points out that that is wrong, it can actually be very difficult to overcome that. And so for a lot of people, the echo chambers are totally fine. They are happy being in their echo chambers. So that's really one of the main things that we have to overcome as a society due to social media. And so for the average person, it's really very easy to remain in these echo chambers, because it's a lot easier to preserve your worldviews, no matter how skewed, no matter how problematic it is, than shattering them completely. Okay. So for me, the main approach to what I sort of like learned from all of this study basically is that media literacy is the way to sort of like go about it. Don't asking people to go into online forums is really not going to be very useful, because again, it's too difficult for people to do. So instead, to improve political engagement, try to improve the development of media literacy. Because again, for me, a lot of studies out there are trying to show that, oh, we're trying to identify cyber troopers, we're using big data analysis to pick out who these people are. But the thing is, for the average person who just looks at their social media space, it's really impossible to tell who is real and who isn't. And rather than trying to figure out, which also is a problem because you may misadvertently label real people as cyber troopers, it's actually better to just sort of like improve the way that you assess information, that rather than think about the person, think about the quality of the information, whether you can determine whether it's legitimate or not. And I would actually tell people to take a cynical view that everybody on the internet is out to trick you. And don't just think that if this is a negative view, I reject it wholeheartedly. That you have to sort of take in this more open approach to protect yourself and to ensure that you can decide what is legitimate or not. And of course, this is of course very, very difficult to instill, because a lot of different parties out there have been trying to erode the foundations of knowledge and media essentially. So this is a very, very uphill battle, but this is something that I'm really pushing as part of my main sort of research agenda in general. Okay, so what can we do then with digital ethnography? I'm almost done with my presentation, for those of you who are wondering why is this taking so long. So given the intersection of cyber troopers, trolls, and diehards, big data would often result in a lot of false positive and maybe exclude others as well. You require a lot of data to work through it, and you also need very, very good contextual understanding through digital ethnography to understand how all this data works essentially.